She was 23 and down to her last dollar. No family left to take her in, no roof of her own, just a small brass syrup grating scoop worn warm by 4 generations of women's hands and 4 single-dollar bills she had earned shoveling driveways through a hard February in St. Johnsbury. And with that $4, she bought a tin-roofed sugar house on a high, snow-buried hillside 2 miles up the hollow road in the town of West Glover, Orleans County, Vermont, in a stretch of the Northeast Kingdom that had not seen smoke rise from a sugar house chimney since the mud season of 1973. The cupola had caved at one corner under the weight of 50 winters. The arch under the evaporator had gone rust red and cold. But what nobody knew, least of all Inga Lindholm herself, was that out behind the sugar house, hung in the bare gray limbs of 153 sugar maples her great-great-grandmother had grafted by hand in 1893, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if these stories mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. She had seen the sugar house listed on a yellowed index card in the window of the West Glover town clerk's office. Sugar house, 7 acres, hillside, $4 or best offer. See Mr. Asa Tremblay at the back of the post office. Late owner Marit Lindholm, deceased 1973. She had $4.12 folded in her coat, the last of 3 weeks of shoveling. She walked the 2 miles up the hollow road on a Tuesday morning in late February, with the snow squeaking under her boots in the way only Northeast Kingdom snow squeaks at 15 below. And she went into the post office and asked for Mr. Asa Tremblay by name. Mr. Asa Tremblay was 79 years old and had run the back window of the post office for 51 of those years. He looked up at her over a stack of seed catalogs, and his hand stopped on the rubber stamp. "Lindholm," he said softly, "from the high pasture. You'd be Marit's great-granddaughter then." Inga nodded once. He took off his cap. "We've been keeping that key 42 years, he said. "Marit left it with my father the autumn before she went, and she told him plain to give it to whichever one of the Lindholm girls came back asking. We were starting to wonder if any of you would." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small iron key on a piece of brown sugar twine, the iron warm from his body. $4, he said, "and the back taxes are forgiven." Marit took care of them in advance. She paid them up to the year 2010. She handed him 4 soft dollar bills. He walked her out under the iron porch awning, and he stood in the cold with his cap still in his hand. And he said very softly, "You go up there before dark. The trees know." She had grown up with the smell of boiling sap, with the long blue plume of wood smoke that came off the sugar house cupola on her grandmother's back hillside above the village of Albany, with the sweet metal smell of fresh sap in a galvanized gathering tank in March, with the deeper, darker, almost caramel smell of the second boil when the sap had thickened into syrup and the foam had to be skimmed with a flat brass skimmer her grandmother had bought used in 1961, with the bright clean smell of new spiles being driven into bark, with the rough damp smell of split rock maple drying in the woodshed all summer long. She had grown up under the rough plank ceiling of her grandmother's sugar house, knees tucked, sitting on a low cedar stool with a tin cup of warm sap in her small hands. She had grown up knowing, before she had words for it, that sugaring is mostly the fire, and that the hands are only the part you see. Her grandmother was Karin Lindholm, born in 1936 in the small frame farmhouse on Tinkham Hill above Albany. She had learned to sugar on the same arch and pans that her grandmother Marit had bought new from the Leader Evaporator Works in St. Albans in 1909. Karin was tall and thin, with rough red hands and a long gray braid she pinned in a single loop over her head when she boiled. Inga had called her Mormor from the first day she could shape the sound. Inga's mother, Linnea, taught 4th grade at the Albany school, so the after-school hours and the long sugar season weekends had belonged to Mormor. Inga learned to read the angle of a hung sap bucket before she could read the alphabet. By 6, she could tap a maple with a brace and bit if Mormor steadied the brace for her. By 8, she could fire the arch and keep a hot, bright fire for a 40-minute run of sap without scorching the pan. By 10, she could grade syrup by eye against the small brass grading scoop, holding the syrup up to the late afternoon light, calling out fancy or medium amber or dark amber or B, with more checking her with the hydrometer and finding her right 9 times out of 10. By 12, she could read the boil. She could stand at the evaporator pan and see, before the thermometer told her, the exact instant the sap rolled over from being sap into being syrup. By 18, she had boiled 11 seasons and made 973 gallons of syrup with her own 2 hands. More, on a Sunday afternoon in March of her 18th year, sat down on the cedar stool beside her, put a long, thin hand on the back of Inga's head, and said, "You are a sugar maker now. The fire knows you. The trees know you." But before Inga or Karin, before there had been a sugar house on Tinkham Hill, there had been Marit. Marit Lindholm had come from a parish on the long shore of the Bothnian Sea in the autumn of 1888, 20 years old, alone, with a worsted coat too thin for a Vermont winter and a small wooden case of grafting knives that had belonged to her father. Her father had been the tree grafter for 3 parishes on the Swedish coast, and Marit had been the only one of his 7 children he had let watch him at the work. He had died of a long lung sickness in the winter of 1887, and he had left her his blessing to go to the country across the sea where the maple trees grew as common as alders. She rode the train from Boston up to St. Johnsbury, and she walked the last 22 miles to West Glover with her case in her hand, and she stopped at the edge of a stony hillside that had been logged off 20 years before. At the far edge of the lot stood 7 old wild sugar maples the original logging crew had left alone because their trunks were too crooked to make good board lumber. Marit walked up to those 7 trees, and she set her hand on the bark of the largest, and she made a decision the village would not understand for 35 years. She traded a winter of housework in the village for a half-acre of that stony lot. The next spring, the spring of 1890, she cut 286 small whipgrafts of nameable maple stock from a sugar woman over in Greensboro named Mrs. Atwood, and she went tree to tree, and she cut and bound and waxed and tagged 286 grafts of true New England rock maple onto Vermont native rootstock in one spring by hand, alone. 153 of them took. She bought a liter evaporator in 1909 in faith before the trees were ready and built the sugar house around it, plank by plank, and the sugar house stood waiting 14 years for the first run. When the first run came, the spring of 1923, the village walked up the hollow road as if to a funeral, and stood in the door of the sugar house and watched Marit Lindholm boil the first 30 gallons of syrup off her hand-grafted hillside, and they understood slowly what they had been watching her do for 35 years. She ran that sugar bush for the next 50 years until the spring of 1973, when her hands could no longer feed the arch. Inga never met her. She knew Marit only by the framed daguerreotype on Mormore's mantel, and by the way Mormore spoke her name, which was the way someone speaks the name of a person they will walk into the woods with again, in some other place. Mormore had 3 rules for the woods. The first was this: a tree is not a faucet. It is a guest you are asking for a drink. You knock on its door politely with the brace and the bit, and you put the spile in soft, and you take what the tree is willing to give you that day, and not a drop more. A tree does not owe you sap. The second was this: the fire is the silent partner. You can have the cleanest pans and the sweetest sap and the steadiest pulse, but if the fire is wrong, the syrup will be wrong, and the trees will have given their sap for nothing. Feed it short. Feed it dry. Never feed it angry. The third was this: the woods are older than the sugar house, and the sugar house is older than us, and we are older than this season, and that is the proper order of things. If you ever find yourself thinking the sugar house is the most important thing on a hillside, you have stopped being a sugar maker and become a businesswoman, and the trees will know it before you do. Mind the woods first. Mormore died in the first warm week of April, after the boil had finished, in her own bed in the small frame farmhouse above Albany. The doctor said it was her heart. Inga was 21. She did not cry. She walked out to the cold sugar house the morning after the burial, and she sat on the cedar stool, and she laid her hand flat on the silent brass face of the front pan, and she stayed there a long time, and only when the spring rain began to come hard on the tin roof did she go back inside. Her mother followed 16 months later. Linnea had been the steady one, and the heart attack that took her came in the parking lot of the school in Albany on a Tuesday morning in August. Inga was 22. She did not cry then either. She learned, the way young women in old farmhouses learn, that the place she had thought was hers had been mortgaged twice over to keep 2 women in nursing care and a young woman in college, and the bank gave her until the new year. She left the farmhouse on the 2nd of January with a small canvas bag, a single suitcase, the brass grating scoop in the breast pocket of her coat, Mormore's plain steel skimmer in her hand, and Marit's case of grafting knives wrapped in a flannel shirt. She drove the borrowed pickup down to St. Johnsbury and slept 3 nights in the cab in the parking lot of a feed store before a woman who came out at 5 in the morning to open the store, a woman named Mrs. Verna Hebert, knocked on the foggy window and said, "You come inside, dear. The coffee is on." Mrs. Hebert gave Inga the room above her own kitchen for the rest of the winter in exchange for the morning chores and the shoveling. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, has there ever been a place you had never been that you nonetheless walked toward as if it remembered your name? The door of the sugar house let her in with the soft scrape of a swollen jam, and the first thing was the cold of a tin-roofed building that has gone 50 winters without a fire under its arch. And then, under the cold, the smell. The faint, persistent smell of 48 seasons of wood smoke and burned sugar and steamed sap that lives in the rafters of an old sugar house, the way the smell of fish lives in the rafters of an old wharf that cannot be cleaned out and would not want to be. She breathed it in, and her hand went to her breast pocket and found the small brass grating scoop, and she closed her fingers around it. The liter evaporator stood in the middle on its arch, the iron cold and rusted at the rivets. The back pan tipped a little where the floor had settled, but the pan was whole. Above the cedar gathering tank along the back wall, on iron hooks, hung Mormore's plain steel skimmer where Mormore had hung it for 60 years, because Marit had hung hers in that exact place before her. Inga set her hand on the cold front pan the way her grandmother had taught her to greet a finish season. Somewhere up on the hill, a single hairy woodpecker was working a dead birch, the small dry rhythm a sound that only old hardwood country knows. She slept the first night in the sugar house on a low cedar cot Marit had built into the wall above the wood box in 1909, under 3 of her own coats and a wool blanket Mrs. Hebert had pressed on her at the door. She woke before dawn and stood on the small porch and looked uphill, and she saw what she had not been able to see in the dark the night before. Behind the sugar house, rising up the south flank of the hillside in a wide and patient curve, stood the sugar bush. The trees were enormous, 153 of them set on the hillside in a pattern that looked at first wild, and that, after a long moment of looking, revealed itself, gently, as not wild at all. The rows curved with the contour of the land. The spacing was even. They had been planted, every single one of them, by a hand that had known what it was doing. She remembered the 3rd rule: mind the woods first. She walked uphill into the sugar bush in her boots through the squeaking February snow, and at the foot of the first great tree she knelt down to lay her hand on the bark in the way Mormore had taught her, and her fingertips brushed against something thin and dull and not bark at all. She brushed away the dry crust of the past summer's leaves in the new snow, and there at the foot of the great tree, half hammered into the bark a hand's breadth above the ground, so that the tree had grown around it, but not over it across 133 years, was a small flat tag of lead the size of her thumbnail. On the lead, in a careful old hand-stamped letter by letter with a punch, were 3 lines. Number 1, grafted spring 1890. Marit. She did not cry. She set her open palm flat against the bark of the tree above the tag, and the tightness that had lived in her chest since the August morning in the school parking lot loosened by some small amount that did not have a name. She walked the sugar bush for the next 3 hours in the rising cold blue light, and she found 151 more lead tags, every single one of the 153 trees marked at the foot, every tag stamped with the same single word at the bottom: Marit. the way a painter signs a canvas. She found tag 153 at the top of the hill on the largest tree of all, and behind that tree, set down at the base of the trunk under a flat granite stone that had been laid carefully and not by frost, she found a small tarred wooden box the size of a brick. She lifted the stone, she knelt in the snow, and she opened it. Inside the box was a single sheet of thin cotton paper that had been waxed against the wet, and on it, in the same careful hand, were 3 lines of writing. The first line was the date, the 14th of April, 1893. The second line read, "To whoever walks this hill on a cold morning after I have gone." The third line read, "Look in the sap lines." She walked back down through the rows, and she went into the sugar house, and she stood in front of the gathering tank, and only then did she understand. From the underside of the cedar tank ran a single long sap line of old hand-coopered cedar pipe, hooped with iron, that disappeared into the back wall and up the hill, an ancient gravity sap line that nobody made anymore, but that Marit had laid in by hand in 1909. Inga walked the line uphill, and she saw, every 20 feet or so, that the line was joined at a small lidded cedar coupling, the kind a tree grafter who had worked her father's coopered apple cider lines would have known how to make. She knelt at the first coupling. She turned the wooden peg that locked the lid. She slid the lid free. Inside the coupling, tucked dry inside the dark line where the sap had not run in 53 years, was a small canvas pouch tied with linen string. Inside the pouch were 11 small gold pieces, American gold $5 pieces from the 1880s and 1890s. She sat in the snow with the pouch in her palm a long time. Then she walked to the next coupling, and the next, and there were 11 of them up the hill, one for every great tree that stood near a junction in the line, and inside each one was a canvas pouch, and inside each pouch was gold. And at the last coupling, the one nearest the great tree at the top, the canvas pouch was bigger, and inside it, wrapped in waxed cotton paper, was a small thin notebook, the sugar house's ledger, every season from 1893 to 1973. And folded inside the cover was a single sealed letter, the wax still dark red, addressed in long, careful writing. To the next sugar maker on this hill. From Marit Lindholm, grafter, West Glover, Vermont. She brought it all back down to the sugar house and laid the pouches and the ledger in a careful row on the long plank table by the south window. She sat down on the cedar stool with a cup of black coffee Mrs. Hebert had given her in a thermos, and she broke the wax with her thumb, and she read the letter aloud to the sugar house, because there was no one else to read it to. To the next sugar maker on this hill. If you have walked the bush from tag 1 to tag 153 and found the box at the top, and if you have walked back down the line and opened the couplings one by one in the way only a person who has been taught cooperated sap lines as a child would think to open them, then you are one of mine, and the hill has called you home. My name is Marit Lindholm. I was born Marit Sjöblom in the parish of Nedertorneo, on the long shore of the Bothnian Sea, in the year 1868, the fourth daughter of a tree grafter named Lars, who taught me everything I know about a knife, a graft, and the patience of a tree. I came to West Glover in the autumn of 1888 with a worsted coat and a case of knives, and I made this sugar bush, every tree of it, with my father's grafting knives in the spring of 1890, and the village laughed at me for 35 years, and then it walked up the hollow road and stood in my door, and I forgave them, because the trees had forgiven them first. The gold in the lines is the savings of a sugar bush. It is one good pouch from the best year of every decade of work the hill gave us, set aside one coin at a time and laid into the line where no thief would ever look, because no thief would ever know that there is a line behind the tank. I did not put it in the floor, and I did not put it in the chimney, because the chimney burns and the floor rots. And the line, daughter, the line was laid by my own hands and was meant to outlast me. Do not be in a hurry to tap. Walk the woods first for a full year. Feed the fire short and dry, and never angry, as Karen will have told you if she lives to teach you, and as I am telling you now in case she does not. Mend the cupola first, mend the gathering tank second. Walk the woods always. The hill is yours, daughter. You are not the owner of this place. You are the one who is currently caring for it. With my whole hand and my whole heart, Marit Lindholm, grafter and sugar maker, West Glover, Vermont, the 14th of April, 1893. Inga laid the letter flat on the plank table. She set her open palm across it. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and breathed in the smoke and sugar ghost of the sugar house, and she felt for the first time since the morning her mother had not come back from the school parking lot, the loosening of the cold, tight thing in her chest, by an amount that did have a name this time. The name was home. She drove the gold pieces down to a dealer in St. Johnsbury the following week, a careful man in his late 60s named Mr. Emile Beauregard, who valued the coins, all 97 of them, at $54,600 at the day's market. She sold 60 of them. She put $15,000 in a small savings account at the Northeast Kingdom Credit Union, and she drove back up the hollow road with a new section of cupola, a roll of tin for the roof, 2 sacks of cement for the arch, 100 new buckets and lids and spiles from the Leader Evaporator Works, and a small green truck of split rock maple firewood from a man in West Glover named Mr. Augustine Bouchard, who had heard, the way Vermonters hear, that there was a young Lindholm woman back on the high pasture. She did not do it alone. By the second week of March, the news had walked the hollow road the way news walks the hollow road, slowly and certainly and through the side door, and the chorus had begun to arrive. The first was Mr. Asa Tremblay himself, who closed the back window of the post office at 4 o'clock on a Thursday and drove his old pickup up with a tin of his wife's maple cookies and a coil of new copper sapline. Marit ran my grandmother an account on credit for the winter of 1931, he said. I came to fix what I can. He went up on the roof with her that afternoon and stayed until the cupola was patched. The next was Mrs. Verna Hebert from the feed store, who drove up on a Sunday with a casserole and a small framed black and white photograph she'd been keeping for 40 years. The photograph was of 3 women standing in the door of the sugar house in 1961, with the steam rising behind them and the spring snow at their boots. Marit, Birgitta, and a young Karin with her gray braid still chestnut brown. That is the one of them I have, Mrs. Hebert said. You take it. It belongs back in this house. The next was Mr. Bouchard with his second load of firewood and a small barrel of his own apple cider vinegar for cleaning the pans. The next was a young woman in her 30s named Mrs. Elise St. Pierre, who had been Karen's last and youngest helper in the seasons before Karen retired, who came up the hollow road one Saturday morning unannounced, in old work overalls and rubber boots, and stood in the doorway of the sugar house and said simply, "Tell me where you need me." She stayed every Saturday of the boil. And the steadiest of all was Mr. Tremblay, who came up every Thursday afternoon all spring and sat on the cedar stool by the arch and read the old ledger aloud to Inga from the first entry forward. He always laid his hand on the doorframe on his way out, and he always said the same thing. The trees know you. The first boil ran the second to last weekend of March, in a sudden warm snap after a hard freeze. Inga walked the bush at dawn with Marit's case of grafting knives slung at her hip, and she set spiles in 78 of the 153 trees in a careful, gentle, polite way, talking quietly to each tree. She fired the arch at 3 in the afternoon, and the sap came down through the old coopered cedar line, sweet and slow and clear, and by 10 o'clock that night with Mrs. St. Pierre at the back pan beside her, the sugar house was filled with the white plume of the first steam off the front pan, and the smell of the first sugar in 53 years was rolling out of the cupola and down the hollow road as far as the village, and 3 pickup trucks pulled in over the course of the night, headlights off, parked at a respectful distance, men and women out of the cabs not speaking, standing at the edge of the yard with their hands in their coat pockets, watching the steam come up out of the cupola the way their fathers and mothers had watched it come up 70 years before. And not one of them said a word. She made 104 gallons of syrup that first season. She grated them with the small brass grating scoop. She bottled them at the long plank table. She labeled them in the old hand. Lindholm, West Glover, Vermont. Then, after a long, quiet evening in the second week of April, she sat down at the table with Marit's case of grafting knives open beside her, and she began, on a fresh page of a fresh notebook, the next ledger. Season 1, 2025. First boil March 22nd. That is the thing about the sugaring our grandmothers teach us, the slow kind, the kind we learn under the rafters of a sugar house when we are 3 years old and our knees are tucked under us on a cedar stool. It is not really about the syrup. The syrup is what the trade gives at the end of a long road. The sugaring is the woods. The sugaring is the polite knock at a tree's door. The sugaring is the fire-fed short and dry and never angry. The sugaring is the order of things, the woods older than the sugar house, and the sugar house older than us and us older than this season, and the gold sewn into the sapline, not because anyone ever needed it, but because someone, someday, will need it more, and you will be long gone, and the trees will still be there, and the sugar house on the bend of the hollow road will still be there, with its door waiting to let the right person in. Inga Lindholm was 23 years old and down to her last dollar. She had a small brass syrup grating scoop and a plain steel skimmer and a case of grafting knives that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother's father on the Bothnian Sea. She had $4 to her name, and she spent it on a tin-roofed sugar house on a high, snow-buried hillside 2 miles up the hollow road in the town of West Glover, Orleans County, Vermont, in a stretch of the Northeast Kingdom that had not seen smoke rise from a sugar house chimney since the mud season of 1973. It was the best $4 she ever spent. If this story has kept you company tonight, thank you for sitting up with us this long. If you would like more like it, slow stories of small northern places and the trades our grandmothers taught us, please subscribe and tell one quiet friend about us. Until then, sleep well, breathe easy, and may your road be a quiet one, and may your morning come in soft, the way the morning came in over the high pasture in West Glover, the first time Inga Lindholm walked out of the sugar house with the small brass grating scoop in her hand and let the cold blue dawn in.